Beyond Resilience is a series of curated conversations created by Firelight with the purpose of exploring the challenges, the strategies, and experiences of creating and distributing work during a time of crisis.
Nobody's going to give us any power until we ask for it, until we demand it. I mean, as filmmakers, we're really good at documenting this stuff, but we're not necessarily great at internalizing it and being collective in the way that we operate, particularly in the USA.
It is not just about funding more filmmakers of color. The decision makers need to change. It is not okay that this small group of white folks are the ones who determine which stories matter, which filmmakers matter, and decide and set the terms on which these stories are made. That is literally what has gotten us to the place that we are in.
There are so many missing narratives in the Black experience that would do so much to help both the understanding of Black people in our current situation, but also other people who are trying to understand what's going on. It did not just happen yesterday. There are documents, there is evidence, there are artifacts.
One of the things that I believe and we believe really strongly at Firelight is that people need to tell their own stories. You know, that stories that are part of my culture and part of who I am. And I think that's really important for us all to do. And so that's what we've tried to push and do at Firelight.
Hello, and welcome to Firelight Media's Beyond Resilience series. Today's panel is in partnership with DOC NYC, America's largest documentary film festival. We're online until November 19th, so if you haven't come by, please come by and check out some of our films. We have a great lineup. I'm Karen McMullen. I am a features programmer at DOC NYC. I am also the director of the Tide Film Festival for people of color across ethnicities. And I'm also a programmer at Tribeca Film Festival. Allow me to introduce Firelight Media in the Beyond Resilience series. Firelight is a premier destination for nonfiction cinema, by and about communities of color. Firelight produces documentary films, supports emerging filmmakers of color, and cultivates audiences for their work. We're here today for the Beyond Resilience series presented by Firelight Media. These are curated conversations exploring the challenges, strategies, and experiences of creating and distributing work during a time of crisis. Firelight Slate takes a global and historical view of films created by filmmakers of color during critical periods of disaster, seeking to learn from the filmmakers, their communities, and the resilience born from collective experiences. We'd like to start today's panel with a land acknowledgement to raise awareness of Indigenous presence in land rights. We all have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism. I'm speaking to you today from Brooklyn, the land of the Munsee Lenape people. I encourage you to look up and share your land acknowledgement in the chat. I'd like to remind viewers that today's webinar is being recorded. You can watch or tell others to watch on DOC NYC's Facebook page and also on Firelight's Beyond Resilience website. A link is being shared in the chat. Thank you today to our ASL interpreter, Brenda Terry. I would like now to introduce your moderator for today's panel, Sahar Driver. Sahar Driver is a documentary impact and engagement strategist. She works closely with Firelight around its impact programming and with the William Greaves and Impact Campaign funds. Sahar is also an educator and researcher and was recently commissioned by the Ford Foundation's JustFilms to research and author the report, which she'll be talking about today. Welcome, Sahar.
Thank you so much, Karen. Hello, everyone. I am dialing in from unceded Chochenyo and Ohlone lands in what is also known as Oakland, California. And I'm excited to be having this conversation with some really impressive people who have been working steadily and powerfully, in some cases for decades, to make the nonfiction film space one that nurtures and strengthens storytelling by and for communities of color. I also want to thank Brenda Terry, our ASL interpreter, but I also wanted to let you know that we have two other people who are helping to make this conversation accessible, Liz Essery, who is doing Spanish translation, and Elizabeth Martinez, who is also doing Spanish translation. And if you want to listen to this conversation in English or in Spanish, you can hit the little globe at the bottom of the screen, and it will immediately turn it into the right language for you. So the decision to have this particular conversation was prompted by a report that I wrote called Beyond Inclusion, the Critical Role of People of Color in the U.S. Documentary Ecosystem, which was commissioned by Ford JustFilms in September of last year. And the research started with our desire to understand the state of independent documentary in the U.S. as it relates to the history and activities and challenges and needs of organizations that are led by and serving people of color. And it was grounded in an understanding that the health of a democracy and of social relations is tied to the health of our media ecosystems. And that a healthy media ecosystem is one that provides the public with access to free and independent storytelling that reflects the diversity of our country. And that's because seeing people who look like us on screen, or having access to stories about people and experiences that interrupt racist stereotypes or troubling narratives, or learning histories that belong to all of us, not just some of us, all of this and more is incredibly important, and it creates the conditions for new possibilities and new conditions where a monoculture of stories and perspectives doesn't. And filmmakers of color have been helping to shape the documentary landscape for decades and working really hard to make it more accountable, inclusive, and equitable. And many of you who are listening in are those people. And this work that that filmmakers of color have been doing has benefited us all. And what the research and paper points to is that when operating in the ideal, these filmmakers have been enabled by strong and resourced organizations that have been in a position to equip them to do their best work. And we wanted to know more about the ecosystem of organizations that are out there and supporting them and what they're doing. And where the research lands, which is simple enough, is that what we absolutely need right now as a matter of urgency is a film industry that looks like our country. Because one of the best ways to strengthen voices of color and support the careers of filmmakers of color so that they can do their best work is to support the organizations and networks, the collectives and other groups that have been addressing the barriers they face and creating an infrastructure of support. So in lieu of getting into all of the details of the paper, and you should totally read it, I thought we'd speak to a few of those leaders who have shown a commitment to POC authorship and leadership and filmmaking in this space, and have a conversation with them about what they do, why they do it, why centering POC leadership and power is so critical, and what people of color-led organizations need to be able to lean into and strengthen that commitment and work. I'll bring each of them up for a brief intro and chat one by one, and then I'll pull all of us in together for a conversation and Q&A. So please submit your questions and we can add them into the discussion. Today we'll be talking with Miriam Bale of Indie Memphis, Madeleine Lim of the Queer Women of Color Media Arts Project, also known as QWOCMAP, Kique Cubero Garcia of the Association of Puerto Rican Documentary Filmmakers, also known as AdocPR, and Chloe Walters-Wallace from Firelight Media. We chose these panelists because they represent various roles and regions and other aspects of the work and have each experienced different challenges and growth edges, which I hope can be helpful and illuminating. So without further ado, I'm going to ask that we pull Madeleine up. Remember, please submit your questions and panelists to the panelists in the Q&A box. Hi, Madeleine.
Hey, Sahar.
Madeleine Lim is the founding executive director of QWOCMAP, and is one of a small number of queer women of color on the international film circuit in the 1990s who saw that only queer women of color would tell their own authentic stories. So she founded QWOCMAP in 2000. Her belief was that a community of filmmaker activists could change the craft of filmmaking and the leadership of social justice movements. So under Madeleine's leadership, QWOCMAP's award-winning filmmaker training program has nurtured the creation of over 450 films. It's the largest catalog of LGBTQ and BIPOC films in existence. And Madeleine is an award-winning filmmaker herself with over 25 years of experience as a producer, director, and cinematographer and editor. And her films have screened at sold-out theaters in festivals around the world. And notably, her film Sambal Belacan in San Francisco remains banned in Singapore. Welcome, Madeleine. I wanted to start by talking about the fact that QWOCMAP has been strengthening POC LGBTQ storytelling for a really long time, sometimes under the radar. And so for people who've never heard of you, what can you share about who you all are and what you all have been doing to support work at this intersection?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to be on the panel, Sahar. And I am always delighted to be in conversation with you. So yeah, as you mentioned, a little bit of the origin story to QWOCMAP was that in '97, I had completed a documentary and it was traveling on the International Film Festival circuit for a couple of years. And with every film festival that I attended, whether it was LGBTQ film festival or a people of color film festival or art film festival, or human rights film festival, I found myself among one handful of queer women of color filmmakers. And I did not see my community at these film festivals. So I thought to myself, where are we? And if we're not making films of our lives, who would? And are we waiting for someone else to do so? And I also knew that as a filmmaker, I might make a film once every 5 years if I'm lucky, depending on fundraising, et cetera. But if I taught filmmaking, that many more films would be created by our community, and that would create, in turn, systemic change and hopefully move the needle. And so I founded QWOCMAP in 2000, Queer Women of Color Media Arts Project. We use film to shatter stereotypes and bias, to reveal inequities, and build community around art and activism. So we create films, exhibit them, and distribute them so that we address intersecting social justice issues that concern our multiple communities, and we invest and develop and nurture the creativity and leadership of queer women of color, both cisgendered and transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and transgender people of color of any orientation. And I want to just really specifically spell it out that we are lesbian, we are bisexual, we're queer women, we are questioning, we are non-binary, gender non-conforming, transgender people, we're intersex, we're two-spirit, we are also of African descent, we're Black, Asian, Chicanx, Chicanx, Latinx, First Nation, Native American, American Indian, Indigenous people, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Southwest Asian, North African, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian, mixed race. We are low income. We're sick and disabled. We are survivors of violence. We are immigrants. So that includes a lot of communities. And very often, sometimes when we say we are queer women of color media arts project, people think that we are a niche within a niche within a niche. But in reality, we really are a bridge to all of those communities that I just named. Right. And because of who we are and because we are part of all these multiple communities, our films provides that nuance and complexity precisely because of our experiences. And that's missing from, the mainstream status quo. We offer 3 main programs. Our filmmaker training program is essentially leadership development. Our exhibition program, our Queer Women of Color Film Festival, builds community. And our distribution program is political education. And our filmmaker training program is completely free. It's the heart of QWOCMAP. And and as you mentioned, over 450 films have been created through our filmmaker training program, which is the largest collection of LGBTQ people of color films in existence. Our film festival is also free. And I would say the main difference about our film festival is that our filmmaker just needs to be an LGBTQ person of color filmmaker, right? The content can be about anything. So we showcase the work of queer and trans BIPOC filmmakers. We've screened over 500 films by now. And, our film festival is completely accessible. That's really important to us, so that all the films have open captions. There are ASL interpreters at every screening. There's food provided that's culturally specific, free childcare, crisis counselors, there's fragrance-free seating. And this is intentionally created so that our community feel safe and welcomed and included in these spaces. And this year, we pivoted our film festival online just like many other folks, and we had people join us from Alaska to Hawaii to Puerto Rico, Peru to South Africa to New Zealand. And the reason for that is that we tie films to community organizations and to movements very deliberately. And our distribution program provides curatorial services, custom curatorial services. It connects films, filmmakers to community organizations and to movements. Our queer and trans films screen at churches, mosques, temples, synagogues. It's political education that's really meant to transform how we think.
Thank you so much. It's so powerful. And hearing the list of communities that make up QWOCMAP I got chills just hearing that whole listing. There's a lot of power there, I think. And I know, because I'm based in the Bay Area, I know QWOCMAP quite well. You all have quite a footprint here, but under the national scale, it's worth, even though you're kind of under the radar, broadly speaking, it's worth noting that here and in a lot of your local events, whether they're here or elsewhere, your events almost always sell out. And so it both points to a real need and a real demand for these stories. But I'm curious if you can speak to the tension of why you think it is that you kind of fly under the radar, and yet you have such a tremendous, there's such tremendous demand and footprint, and also what it means for the nonfiction industry, and more broadly for society, that you all exist.
Sure. We fly under the radar for all the reasons that, racism, sexism, white supremacy, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, all those issues, right? And the reason that there is such a need is because we don't see ourselves in the films that are available out there. Back when I started the first set of workshops, I knew there was a need. I wasn't sure about the interest. And, when I flyered, this was back in the late 90s, when I put out flyers for the filmmaking workshops, there was a huge response. There was such a huge community response. There was a wait list that lasted over 2.5 years long. We still have a wait list that's over 2.5 years long. At that time, we offered 4 workshops a year. Folks generally had to wait a couple of years to get into the workshop. And these workshops were 4-month-long workshops, a college semester almost. And folks would actually move to the San Francisco Bay Area for the 4 months just to take these workshops. And we would get these requests from people outside of the United States, from Canada and Mexico and Lebanon and Uganda and China, to bring out workshops to these countries. And so it was clear to us that there was a need, that people did not see themselves represented in the media that existed and did not have access to this art form, right? This art form is it's an expensive art form. It is, film training itself is expensive. And so we just did not have access to this resource. And so what we did was we really built up QWOCMAP around our values. We wanted our workshops to provide a safe space that supported our filmmakers. Again, it's based on my experience of being in film classes when I screened something and nobody understood it because they couldn't get past whatever the issues were, the homophobia that was working in their head. And so we wanted to provide, a safe space so that we could come into that space, not have to explain ourselves, and feel free to create. We provide filmmaker mentors. We provide crisis counselors at our workshops, because we understand that sometimes, especially when we have young folks who are 18 to 24, and they are maybe living at home with family and they're not necessarily out yet, and they're trying to tell a story that requires them to really go into a vulnerable space, right? And so seeing all of this and building in how to support all of the participants as we are trying to create, right? So, and just to, touch on a point that you brought up, the fact that we are sort of under the radar. We are, as a nonprofit organization, we are tiny. As a queer and trans people of color film organization, we are actually a worldwide institution. We survived the dot-com bust, we survived the recession, we've lasted 20 years. And we actually have a transnational reputation among LGBTQ people of color. And we are the largest organization of our kind in the world, and the first, and again, it goes back to community need. And I think key to understanding what this need is all about is that we, because of all of the different oppressions that we face, right? These are the reasons that our work gets discounted, or our thought leadership gets ignored, or our impact gets devalued. And so making justice and equity our focus, infusing these values very intentionally into our theory, our practice, our vision, not just who's in front of the camera, not just who's behind the camera. It's, what story are we telling? How are we telling these stories? What are the social justice implications of our creative choices? How are we holding ourselves accountable to community, right? So that film is not just a tool for social justice, it is, but for us, film is movement. Film itself is movement.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I mean, that's such something that really struck me in the research that I did, is just how much output and power these small but mighty organizations have. And I think it's really driven by this commitment and and especially in your case, the vision that you are part of a social movement. So yeah, that hear that loud and clear. I'm going to move on to our next panelist real quick and bring you back up in a second, Madeleine. But the next person that I wanted to talk to is my colleague at Firelight Media, Chloe Walters-Wallace. Welcome, Chloe. While you're kind of being brought up, I wanted to also say that I just learned that we have a second ASL interpreter named Amber Bertolute. And so Amber, I wanted to thank you for your services today too. Chloe, welcome. Chloe Walters. Hi. Chloe Walters-Wallace is the manager of Firelight Media's artist programs, which includes the documentary lab, and Firelight's newest initiative, the Groundwork Lab, which she leads. The Groundwork Lab aims to expand the pipeline of emerging diverse makers from the South, the Midwest, and the U.S. territories. And before this, Chloe led the New Orleans Film Society's Emerging Voices of Mentorship Program and the Southern Producers Lab, which is a regional program bringing together 13 emerging diverse producers from across the South, which is important because it's that experience and expertise that is really, I'm hoping that we could talk about today. Chloe, I see so much resonance between what QWOCMAP does and what Firelight does, but today I wanted to kind of zero in on a particular aspect of your work that I was referring to, which is the experience of strengthening the possibility for filmmakers of color outside of the LA-New York binary to flourish. And through your work at Firelight, you've continued to help lay a foundation and build capacities that make it possible for aspiring filmmakers of color outside of those major film centers to begin to build careers. So for people who aren't aware of the Groundwork initiative, can you share a little bit about what it is and why it exists?
The Groundwork Regional Lab serves early career documentary filmmakers of color in the South, Midwest, and U.S. territories. They're working on short and long form projects. And to serve those filmmakers, we try to create a sustainable ecosystem that includes public television stations, local media arts organizations, and independent filmmakers, which exists on collaboration, community, and really establishing more networks. All of that results in a weekend-long lab that's shaped by our organizational partnerships. We make sure to have these really lengthy discussions before moving into any space, so we're not duplicating work that already exists, that we're really supporting organizations and stations and filmmakers in the ways that they need. So that lab can be fit and flexible to whatever is the local space necessity. we try to figure out where there are gaps. We try to create space for people to confess where the resources are lacking or where things have fallen short. And we just try to make sure that folks have a stake in the work, have a stake in supporting filmmakers of color and understanding that there might need to be a little bit more work to push further to create those connections. The filmmakers are nominated by our local partners and then connected with us. And then they're offered the tools to understand how to enter the documentary landscape. What stage of your project should you be applying for funding? How to build a relationship with industry? How to create a professional work sample? There are all of these things that is the language of the documentary industry that is not necessarily shared or provided in every single space across our country. I think of it as kind of learning the language of doing the SATs, of creating a documentary core application and the things that you need to set up. We also have a partnership with the Flaherty Seminar to talk about art, to literally just provide a space for people to watch short documentaries that span a range of styles and experiences, but that are connected to local conversations that are happening, so that at every point we're completely relevant to the place where we are. When I moved to New Orleans 8 years ago, just to talk about why this exists, there are a number of systemic issues that are in place and are in place. Things are changing, funding priorities are changing, geographical diversity is no longer just a kind of tagline for everyone. People are really investing in that work. Firelight has been investing in that work for the past 5 years. I met Loida and started working with Firelight because of the investment that Firelight made in the space. But the systemic issues that came up were things like large production companies that are extremely well funding coming down to the South, or independent filmmakers coming down to the South, feeling a fascination with, you know, the moss that grows on the oak trees, with all of these kind of cultural nuances that seem like it's another world, although it's still in America. And then those stories get extracted and the local filmmakers get left behind. Yeah. Often they aren't hired on those productions. Often those stories don't involve their input, or they're hired as fixers. As Elaine Sheldon has spoken before about, if you can imagine Elaine Sheldon, who is literally an Oscar award-winning filmmaker, how that trickles down to filmmakers of color, and how the lack of experiences and opportunities are put forth. So on the flip side of that, it's also a region that has smaller local economies, or economies that are struggling and then do not necessarily recognize or prioritize funding art, or especially filmmakers. And then also on top of that, filmmakers of color. And then on top of all of this, there's the historical roots of racism, as Madeleine was talking about. And then there's the historical roots of prejudice between the North and the South, which exists since the Civil War, and somehow still play out into how people view what the other regions of our country are about. You know, there's a lot of conversation every year around the election. Who are these other people who don't live in New York and LA? And the point is, they're also Americans. This comes from a foundation of history that we all have to recognize and grapple with. So yeah, there's also some logistical issues of again, that knowledge not being shared throughout the region, in terms of again, as we serve people of how to enter the documentary landscape, everyone applies for funding at the production stage because that's the biggest dollars, and not understanding how to build relationships over time with funders to really access things at development and build your documentary as you move forward.
Totally. I mean, it's so important because I think a lot of this stuff is invisible sometimes. People don't take for granted how many things and how much capacity is needed and how much understanding of the industry is needed in order to even begin to think about this work and being a part of it. I am curious what you're learning about what it takes to build infrastructure that we need in regions that are outside of these major film hubs that already have robust industries. I need just a few quick highlights.
Sure, absolutely. I think that one of the things is there are very few, I hate the term gatekeepers, but I'm trying to rework this into champions for filmmakers of color.
Great, I like it.
And there are very few of those folks in the industry that are based regionally. I can't tell you how important I've found it to be in a room to advocate for filmmakers of color. And then on top of that, filmmakers of color who are based in underserved regions, to make sure that people understand, again, that maybe knowledge is not being distributed. I've been in rooms where we're reading a bunch of pitches and the folks who are based in New York and LA have that language to apply for documentary film. And so people are immediately drawn to that proposal, that understanding of experience, and then discount that as much as another piece might be a strong story because the proposal isn't sorted out correctly. That person could lose that opportunity. I've had to say that person has had more opportunities to pitch films, even amongst the groups of filmmakers of color as well. A couple other points that I'll be really, really quick about: providing intentional and thoughtful resources so that those local communities can organize themselves, introducing folks to people and resources outside of their local communities, unpacking regional prejudice. If you're a part of an institution, those are a lot of blind spots that people have. Unpacking the idea of what experience is in production, unpacking the idea of what an audience might want to see or hear, and really thinking of discovering new audiences. People don't think that there are Black people in Appalachia, but they exist and they are there and they work and they've been a part of our history for as long as they've been there. Literal space. Yeah. If we ever get out of the pandemic, actually creating spaces for people to come together and work on films collectively. As Firelight has afforded me the ability to work for national organizations, but still live in the place where you want to work and serve the people. It provides so much context. I'm able to have coffee with folks creating work that are locally here, understand what's happening based in the region, and just, I was in a hurricane with the rest of the filmmakers that are experiencing these things. And that kind of cultural understanding and context is invaluable for me. And I hope for the filmmakers that we serve as well.
Yeah. Totally. It's so valuable and the perspective that it offers. And I wanted to pull someone else into this conversation who's also trying to build a regional infrastructure and ecosystem. Kique, can you come up too as well now? Kique Cubero Garcia is a documentary filmmaker, editor, sound recordist, researcher, and video photographer. His recent projects include Pedro Angel, I hope I said that right, Rivera Muñoz's Desalambrando, and Karen Rossi's Ser Grande, which Kique won the Best Cinematography Award for at Rincon International Film Festival. He's been engaged in video making workshops with the Taller de Fotoperiodismo, Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueña and Taller Cinemático and other community-based organizations. He's also one of the founding members of AdocPR and a member of the programming team for the Muestra de Cine Documental Latino America en Nosotros. How did I do, Kique? I tried. Kique is going to be speaking in Spanish, and the interpreters will translate for the audience. But Kique, I wanted to start with a question to you about something that the report underscores is how urgent it is that we strengthen infrastructure that supports filmmakers of color in general, but also in this moment. And through your work at AdocPR, you also have been focused on building a nonfiction film ecosystem in Puerto Rico. But you are doing this not just during a pandemic, but also in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and in a US colonial territory. The work that you're doing to support artists there to be able to work another day is especially urgent. Can you share a bit about what it means for people in Puerto Rico to be able to tell their own stories on their own terms, and what AdocPR has been building over the last few years to make that possible?
First of all, I want to thank everyone and blessings to everyone who is listening, and thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. I will say it in English, and I don't find the words in English. I will say in Spanish.
Okay.
So we've been subjects of imperial gaze, and through our history, we have been trying to find our way of looking ourselves. So that started during the 50s, when there was a booming of filmmaking, but it was part of a political project of masking the U.S. colonial relationship with Puerto Rico. But that was the seed of the filmmakers of the 60s and 70s who were more critical, have a more critical gaze of, and started to look in ourselves differently. So AdocPR just take our work, take from that legacy, and we have tried is to develop that and give a continuation of that, especially as a collective, because the difference between the filmmakers of today's and the filmmakers of back then is that they didn't organize as a collective.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would love to hear a little bit more about what the value of organizing as a collective is, in your opinion, because that's really interesting. But also what it has looked like to build that infrastructure. What are some of the challenges that you're having to address to make it possible for filmmakers to tell their stories? And if you have anything that you can say about how that has changed over the last 8 months with the pandemic as well.
So the thing is that the main problem that we have is the continuity, because we don't have an industry. So because we don't have an industry, there's you could see, like, you see a film in 4 years, maybe 2 or 3 films in 1 year. That's in the base of cases. Yep. But then it stops. Then it lasts 5 years without a film. So there's no continuation in filming. So people don't have like a workshop to develop narrative skills. So that's one of the things that we try to address collectively, like trying to develop those narrative skills to our filmmakers, but also creating like public value, like to raise awareness to our people to start valuing our film, because we are bombarded by Hollywood films, and people think of documentaries as just talking heads.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we did collectively, the first thing that we did as AdocPR was create this showcase of documentaries, of Latin American documentaries, with two objectives. The first objective was to show people, to educate people, that documentary could tell stories in different ways, not just talking heads.
Mhm.
And the other objective was to connect us with the Latin American realities, to start seeing us as a Latin American reality, although we have a colonial relationship with the US.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
after Maria, what we have done is deep in that.
Yeah. Thank you, Kique. That's really important, and I think I want to underscore the urgency. I think of in this moment to be able to hear perspectives from Puerto Rico, and I'm curious if you could say what you would say. What do you think programmers, funders, and other decision makers in the States here should be thinking about when it comes to the role of an organization like yours? Like, what should they be thinking about in terms of the support that you need in order to be able to do what you do?
I would say like trust.
Mm-hmm.
Trust in the sense that they don't see us as capable of making films.
Mm-hmm.
Like they don't see us like, because we, for instance, I will give you an example. If we could do a film of 1 hour with $1,050, but when we make a proposal and put a budget of $1,000 or $1,050, they don't see like we are serious. They don't take us serious, because they think with the framework that they operate in the US mainland.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't trust us as capable of doing films.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say the first thing is like trust, especially nowadays, that if you're gonna have a relationship with us, it's not just a relationship with different individuals. It's a relationship with a collective that we've been working almost 10 years to organize our sector.
Yeah.
Not only documentaries, because we started as a documentary organization, but since the other organization of fiction filmmakers disappeared, that we have to address also the fiction filmmakers. So we have in our membership fiction filmmakers also.
Yeah, there's a lot of crossover in our communities for sure. Thank you, Kique. I'm going to pull up Miriam Bale, who is our next panelist, and someone I'm also a huge fan of. Hi, Miriam. Miriam Bale is the artistic director of the Indie Memphis Film Festival. She's written on film for a range of outlets: the New York Times, the New York Daily News, the New Republic, IndieWire, Sight and Sound, W Magazine, Film Comment, Hollywood Reporter, and on and on. Miriam is the founding director of La Di Da Film Festival in New York. She's organized film programs at Anthology Film Archives, BAM Cinematic, 92Y, Yerba Buena Art Center here in the Bay, and Flaherty, New York City. Thanks for joining us, Miriam.
Thanks so much for having me, Sahar. It's so nice to be here with you and Kique, and with my blue button-down crew, Madeleine and Chloe. They're all dressed alike.
Totally. Just for folks who don't know about Indie Memphis, can you just share a bit about the work you all do to support filmmakers of color in the region?
Sure. We support filmmakers of color in Memphis, but also nationwide. We are a film festival primarily. We started as a film festival. We just ended our 23rd edition. And we also do year-round programming, which is fairly new, just in the last, not too new, but we do year-round programming. We are also very big in artist support. We've had a few programs long-term called indie grants, where we're very big on giving material support to artists, to filmmakers, knowing, especially in our programs that support filmmakers of color, because we know you can't do anything if you can't pay your rent and can't buy your equipment or can't do. So that's a big part of everything we do. Our indie grants are to local Memphis filmmakers. And then we started something that is part of our Black Creators Forum, which is started as a symposium that takes place just before the film festival for Black creators and scholars and filmmakers to all come together for different talks and panels and workshops. And part of that program, we do some film series, and we do something called the Black Filmmaker Screenwriting Residency and Fellowship. And those are both national and for a Memphis filmmaker. And those are interesting. Those programs have really grown. They just to give you an example of what we do with those programs, that they're the Filmmaker Screenwriting Residency started with, this is our third year, and in our first year we had one nationwide, which was great. And then we got a grant to expand it. Actually, we got a grant from Barry Jenkins, who was the person choosing our finalists. We have one filmmaker choose among the finalists for the participants. And so we expanded it to include Memphis filmmakers and national filmmakers. And now we've expanded it to more, so we're a small program, but we're growing. And so now we have 3 in the program. And it's been really interesting to see how what we found is that the filmmakers, we started out with the knowledge that we needed to just give someone space and time. And so that's what it was, to give them a residency, was to give them enough money to take some time off of work and a space to work, and just to, we know these people, that they have a script in their head, they need to finish it. So we wanted to give them space and time to do that. What we found is they also, of course, need training. They need help in how to pitch. We've found a lot of our filmmakers didn't know what a pitch deck was. So that's part of it, connecting them with producers. But now we found that as the program grows, and we have one filmmaker choosing all of the participants, it was Barry Jenkins, and this year it was Boots Riley. They found a community of filmmakers who have the same kind of vibe. With Boots Riley, they all have this sort of magical realism vibe. And so they found this national community, and that's what we found that they also need. They need to be part of they need not just advice from above, they need a peer community. So this is some of what we do. And so Memphis is a Black city, so we're very focused on Black filmmakers. And what we try to do is, Atlanta exists, Los Angeles exists as a place for great hubs for more sort of Hollywood Black filmmaking. And what we try to be is really a place for like indie Black filmmaking. Both the filmmakers I mentioned represent it, plus lots of filmmakers that you might not have heard of, but you should have. And we're hoping that you will with some of our programs.
Yeah, Miriam, in one of our conversations, you said that Indie Memphis, that you all, it's really not a white man's film festival, but a place where people of color dominate. And I think that has a lot to do with your leadership there, and the vision that you hold and the commitments that you hold. Can you share a bit about the kinds of decisions that you have to make, and like how you've been able to do that, and how you've set it up to achieve that to the degree that you have?
Sure. Well, thank you for bringing that up. It is kind of our goal and something that I think comes from, it's not often stated because it is in our DNA of what we're doing. And I think that we're not a Black film festival. We're not a women's film festival, but our programming team is all women. And we have a focus on Black filmmakers, and we have maybe 50% of our films are made by people of color. A huge percentage of women filmmakers, probably there are very few white men in our jury. Like we have a very, and I think what we often don't realize is we're not a specialist film festival, we're a general indie film festival. And I think most of our peers of general indie film festivals are white men film festivals without realizing it. That's the sort of default, and they dominate. And that's just not what happens at our festival. And thank you so much for saying it's because of my leadership, but I came in, that was what first brought me as a visitor to the festival. Like I had heard it was a festival, one of the only indie film festivals with significant Black audiences. And so I came and found that was true. And then when they were hiring, I was able to sort of extend that and expand that. And how that happened is something that you and I have talked about, Sahar, is there were significant Black audiences, but they tended to be segregated. There were Black audiences or white audiences, as a lot of America is, a lot of the South, and we also we needed to try to expand that in a way that was that felt more organic to Memphis. And so that happened, and we also had a history of Indie Memphis was a predominantly white institution and had that reputation. So these were all things that we are constantly working on and evolving and having difficult conversations about. The programmer before me was a Black guy, great, Brandon Harris. So he had already been doing some really interesting programming, really mixing, like we don't value diversity or artistry. They're both equally valued, or it's not one or the other, it's the same thing for us. And we, so how do we do that? We did it because my boss basically gave me full reign. He gave me the full reign to make decisions, to creatively, financially. And I think, okay, a few things. I know I'm running out of time, but so I think how we did that is, first of all, like, who is the target? I think the first thing to think about is who's the target audience. And I think for a lot of institutions that are well-meaning, they default to that a white audience without realizing it. And I think that happens even internally, like within your peers, your bosses. I find so many peers who are, want to do something radical, but they have to bring it up to their boss, who is a white person, but a well-meaning white person, but it's hard to get those ideas across, or they're trying to juggle these sort of low-key racist ideas and how to tell their well-meaning boss that it's low-key racist. And so having complete freedom eliminates that. I had been in that situation so many times as a writer with editors, and then in different situations. So I had complete freedom. And the other thing that we moved towards is, so my primary audience was myself and my peers. And what did we want to see? We wanted to see, we were sick of being on diversity panels. We were sick of talking about diversity. And I think when you're not when you're not constantly talking about, oh, how do we get to diversity? When you just make it diverse, when you just have no longer white men, then you can stop talking about diversity and start talking about art and industry and evolving and all of the things that we got into this business for. And so that's what we did. And with a primary focus on women of color and especially Black women, just because I wasn't seeing that. I want to give a shout out to like, it was so much our focus this year that our new t-shirts say the future of film is Black women. So I think we can link to those shirts after the talk.
Sweet.
I would encourage you all to wear that truth.
It's like super important. That's the heart of the matter, I think, is the way that power is held at institutions matters so much, and it shapes what that institution is and does and feels like. I'd like to bring everyone back up now so that we can kind of have a conversation together. And Miriam, there's a lot has been spoken already, and I'm curious, like I want to ask everybody if there are things that you've heard that kind of spark something in you, or questions that you have for each other, so that we can kind of have a conversation together. But Miriam, if you wanted to kick that off, I would give the floor to you, or to anyone else who wants to kind of ask a question. Otherwise, you're going to get my questions.
No, that's wonderful. I mean, I was resonating with what all of you said, with what Madeleine said about, focusing on the content creator rather than seeing, diversity on screen and diverse content. It's like letting the filmmaker make what they want to make. And that's what I mean is, if your audience is like white readers, or like assuming a white audience, then I think it's a huge. And the other thing, and with Kique and with Chloe, I loved hearing about something that we all know intuitively, but how racist certain ideas, racist and classist, and obviously regionalist, certain ideas of professionalism and experience. And, for us, it's even, so I would love to hear all of you, especially Chloe, since you spoke about it, and Kique, talk about what are some of those things that you see that need to be sort of adjusted. To what lenses do we need to adjust as far as what we think of as a successful, like a talented artist? Like, what do we need to go in with to readjust? If that question makes sense.
Chloe, I think you might be muted.
So many mute buttons. Sorry. First of all, I want some of that merch. I would like a shirt, by the way, personally. So in terms of things that need to change, I wanted to say that when I was talking about language before, again, we provide those tools for those language, but I think that that idea of having to have a language is extremely problematic. We should be able to meet filmmakers where they're at and adjust our expectations in order to do so. And so, and this is a conversation that actually got brought up through working with a collection of organizations that I'm working with called IMA South. And Lana Garland is the one who brought up that fact, who is just truly one of the most amazing human beings in the world. But the idea of there being local filmmakers who are resonating with audiences, who are building audiences, who are making work, and maybe their production value is a little off, or maybe the way that they write out proposals isn't fully expressed, but you can see a kernel of vision, an idea, and focus, and innovation there that is, I think, important to locate, especially if they're already serving their local audiences and resonating with them and building that on their own, without us, without anybody else. That is, I think, an amazing understanding of experience. The idea that because you've created a local film or a film that hasn't had national broadcast or national recognition, that you're somehow beneath or not quite at the place as other filmmakers, I think is another issue. I think that's the fact that you're able to make something that is, I mean, I still believe in production value, but that resonates, I think, is incredibly, incredibly important. And again, as Kique said, trust in that is paramount. And I think that that also comes from the way our organizations work with us and the way that you talked about your boss giving you full reign, that they trust you and trust us to make decisions and create slates and be in spaces that we know that we're going to represent those organizations and those filmmakers and recognize where there are those gaps is gold. It's paramount.
Absolutely. Kique, did you have something you wanted to say? You're on mute, by the way.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Right now?
Yep.
So I will try to say in Spanish.
Yeah.
Sí, en nuestro, yo pienso que una
Right. I think that one of the things that has to do with what you were talking about, what we were talking about in terms of trust, the thing is that when you approach a documentarian, a filmmaker who's telling their story, that imperialist attitude tends to show that, you know, we don't know the know-how.
Yeah.
And so they have to listen better. So the other side of the coin of trust is listening. If you don't listen what someone else is saying, then from the get-go, you're creating an unequal relationship and a relationship where there's not a two-way respect. And so if you don't have that initial respect from the get-go, then what effect is that going to have on the story that's being told and to whom it's being told? So I'd say that this is just a basic attitude in terms of respect. Just closing your mouth for a minute and then listening.
Thank you for the frank, real talk, Kique. Yes, yes. But in terms of like, I think each of us, each of you on the panel have had someone listen to you and trust you at some point in your careers, maybe at multiple points in your careers that were really pivotal. And I do want to talk about some of the, you know, in the report, I traced the ways that early support for Black Side, who made the series Eyes on the Prize, helped to support and strengthen the careers of a cohort of filmmakers and leaders of color who went on to have a ripple effect that in turn supported other filmmakers of color and on, creating sort of a diaspora of support from that one institution. And that's just one of many institutions that have really been offering important support, sometimes for decades. Some of them are cropping up more recently. And they're the fruits of some of that early support. And I'm just curious what kinds of lineages you all trace that have made it possible for you all to do the work that you currently do. Like, whose shoulders do you all stand on? It would be, I think, a valuable thing to hear. Anyone could go.
Can I just add a little bit to earlier you were talking about support and infrastructure.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to, especially early on in QWOCMAP, into our second year of conducting workshops, we were conducting our workshops at a separate venue that was accessible, wheelchair accessible, and we just needed another space for our second year. And the Sunset Neighborhood Beacon Center basically came to us and said, we would love to host your queer women of color filmmaking workshops at our space. And the Sunset Neighborhood Beacon Center is, you know, they run an after school program. There's lots of young people running around that are knee high. They conduct, you know, accounting in Cantonese. They conduct, you know, computer workshops for elders, and they saw value in having us and having our community at their space. And not, they did not just provide the space. I mean, they provided, you know, workshop space to host our workshops for 12 years. They didn't just provide the space, they also provided administrative support. They also provided and donated equipment, because that very first year of our workshop, I was conducting workshops. I had access to chairs and paper. We had photocopies, right? We did not have computers. We did not have cameras. This was, you know, in 2000. And so laptops were not as readily available. They were really expensive. And so that initial support meant so much to us, and really helped us grow. We you know, it really, it was instrumental to our growth. And we are deeply rooted in community. And at our very first film festival, you know, there were a number of community partners that just stepped up. You know, Latino Forum donated wine. API QC, which stands for Asian Pacific Islander Queer Women Transgender Community. They donated trays and trays of sushi. Queer Cultural Center donated tech services, you know, and so this is, you know, when we're small and we're just starting out, these kinds of support were so important to us, right? And I think moving into sort of investing in our filmmakers, you know, it's the regular standard thing. You invest in filmmakers by giving them opportunities, by giving them resources. You know, some filmmakers get wine and dine right out of film school. You know, how do we want to invest in our filmmakers? How, you know, how can we provide them with opportunities to flex their creative muscle, right? And so it's, you know, we just had a session just a couple of days ago with our youth filmmakers, 18 to 24-year-olds, and they were asking for connection. They were asking for mentorship and filmmaker networks and filmmaker resources. And like Kique said, it's really about listening to that and providing that so that they can actually grow. You know, and you know, just thinking about Queen Sugar. You know, Ava DuVernay produces that show, and yeah, I remember it made headlines when they decided to hire women directors to direct the television series. And we're not talking about it's either or, like Miriam said. You know, these are all women directors who had experience directing feature-length narrative films already, but were never ever given that opportunity to direct television, right? And so the talent is there, you know, or we nurture the talent. I mean, we literally at QWOCMAP, we are creating the pipeline with these young folks, right? And then just letting them blossom, you know, and providing what they need. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be that you're having to hustle every single moment to find the support that you need from this person and that person. I mean, clearly there's a tremendous demand for the work that you do, the stories that come out of QWOCMAP, the support that you offer is critical. The support that each of you is offering to filmmakers is critical. And I think that that's the heart of the matter, I think, is that when we invest and support in the organizations and the individuals that are investing in and supporting the filmmakers of color whose voices are absolutely imperative to the moment that we're in, there is like a tremendous amount of opportunity there. And that's something that I think we need to be thinking about, because the last 7 years that have been there's been so much activity and energy among up and coming filmmakers, up and coming leaders of color, who are all working so hard to create the conditions that we need in this industry and in this country to support their storytelling. And I don't think that people should be fighting so hard to be able to do that work. So thank you for that example. I think it's really valuable and really important. I've been told that we have about 10 minutes left, and I am super curious about this question about like the work that kind of people have been doing that made it possible for you all to kind of end up in the positions that you've been in, and to do the work that you do that goes on and pays it forward to others. But if you have other more pressing things that you want to say, I of course welcome those as well.
I'll give a quick shout out to Cameron Bailey is, I think, somebody of a good North Star of work he's been doing. And for me, it was not only obviously his position of power, but his history of planet Africa, his knowledge, and even more than that, just like hearing from people who worked from him, they really felt like he got it. You know, like he wasn't someone who didn't pay it forward or who felt they felt like, you know, the word from most people who worked with him was, yeah, that he was cool, and that, you know, he's been a role model. This is a sort of probably not what you're asking, but it comes to mind a programmer, Jake Perlin. He was at BAM Cinematech for a long time and is now at Metrograph. And Jake programmed a long time ago a Bill Gunn retrospective that was really important to me and a lot of people. And the thing about Jake is that he programmed that just because the films were interesting, you know, like the films were interesting, the filmmaker was interesting. And he's a white guy, Jake, and to program the same boring auteurs is just, it's not imaginative. It's not curious. And I feel like he's shown, as like a curious cinephile, you're going to naturally be drawn to women, to people of color filmmakers, to the undiscovered, to the uncelebrated. And I think he's been, you know, did the Bill Gunn thing before Black filmmakers were were trendy and in the current world. And then there's so many peers I mentioned before that unfortunately, as a Black woman, in the last 10, 13 years, I've so often been like the first Black woman in my position or in a space. So there's not really a direct lineage of, but there is, there's the history of filmmakers and knowing the history of filmmakers and how tough it was and how isolated they were. And there's all of my peers, and just like, you know, that peer network is so important, of just being like, as a critic, it was, oh yeah, did they ask you to be the token Black person to review this one film? Yeah, when you said no, they asked me. You know, like, it's like we all, like, having those peer networks are so important. And again, it's like who I do the work for, and I couldn't have survived without them. And we're so often without precedent in the work that we do, that I think that often it's like our lineage is just pure imagination, like, you know, and that can be a really good thing. That can be a really good thing of not having a direct precedent, but trying to imagine something new.
Thank you.
I don't know, Kique, do you want to jump in to answer this question, or should I?
Sí.
Okay, go ahead.
Sí. Bien rápido. En mi caso
So fairly quickly, in my case, I had 3 instructors. First, filmmakers from Puerto Rico that worked in Boston and New York during the 60s, 70s, and 80s that returned to Puerto Rico, and they taught many of us. But Angel Rivera is one of them that I still work with. Mr. Villar, that worked in Boston. Those were my first teachers. And then after that, which shows the importance for public services in financing for filmmaking. When I started working, I worked with AdocPR, which is the public network in Puerto Rico, which is right now being sold. It's going to become privatized. In that public station was a school for many of us that started this career, and especially those that started around 2000. That was our main school to try out things. And after that, when I went to Cuba to study filmmaking, to really study in depth what I had learned with Puerto Ricans from the diaspora and the experience with public television. Then in Cuba, I had the opportunity to have awareness of the responsibility, the social responsibility that we as filmmakers have, especially when we come from towns that have not allowed us to dream freely. And we as filmmakers, when we have an opportunity to dream, that provides us not only a privilege, but also it's a great responsibility with our people.
It's so so well said, and to underscore the importance of public resources and like how much that has mattered to the success and possibility of filmmaking, like you're describing, is just so incredibly valuable. Chloe, were you going to say something?
I'll say something really quick. My first job in artist services was under the mentorship of Tamir Muhammad at Tribeca Film Institute, RIP. And I got that job because during my interview, my phone rang and it was a Beyonce ringtone. And he didn't see it as unprofessional, he didn't see it as problematic. That is exactly what got me the job. He was like, this person understands my cultural references and we can work together. And that I will forever be grateful to him for. Just to talk about cultural resources, I forgot to mention one thing about Groundwork and the way we're expanding.
Yeah.
We're doing a new project called the Hindsight Project, which commissions 6 filmmakers of color across the South, Southern perspectives, making digital shorts about this moment of 2020, about their communities. And so I just really want to underscore how important it is to have that space as a public resource. We're working with Real South and the Center for Asian American Media, both public television, public NMCA stalwart spaces, and this is the way we're able to provide opportunities for early career filmmakers of color. And it's completely invaluable and really exciting. So more to hear on that.
Yeah.
So also thank you to them as well.
Yeah. Madeleine, do you want to add something before I close this out?
Absolutely. I would just love to give a shout out to, our queer and trans people of color filmmakers, particularly Marlon Riggs, who is such, an amazing hero. He passed away, I think, 25 years ago. He's a Black gay man with amazing films. And I remember there was an interview with him that I watched where he talked about how, the narrative genre didn't work for him. The documentary genre didn't work for him. The experimental genre didn't work for him. And so he came up with this mixed genre hybrid that is, that you can see in all of his films, with Tongues Untied. It includes scripted scenes along with poetry and dance and music with archival footage, right? And Pratibha Parmar is the other one. Pratibha, born in Kenya, raised in London, makes her home between the Bay Area and London now. When I first got to San Francisco, I think her set was the first set I walked onto. And just as a PA, and I was, and she's a South Asian lesbian, and I loved her vision. It was lyrical and poetic, and she was setting up these screens and scarves, and I think she might have been shooting Kush, I'm not sure. And it had a profound impact on me. And so I know I definitely stand on a lot of queer filmmakers, queer and trans filmmakers of color who have come before, and their aesthetic. And can I just add one more thing? I know we're sort of running out of time. Just to say, in terms of, this art form is barely 125 years old, right? And, the motion picture production code came into effect in the 30s, and it's been enforced for, many decades. And that was a very intentional mandate to uphold the sanctity of white Christian heterosexual marriage. And they were very clear about that. And the films were not allowed to glorify sinners. You know, it was supported by the religious right. The Catholic Church, you know, supported it. And so, you know, this, and it still impacts how films portray race, gender, sexuality today. And we just have to be as intentional, if not more, about our own strategy, right? To reclaim this as our own art form so that, you know, for our own communities, so that it amplifies our voices. So I just wanted to add that.
It's super important, and I appreciate that so much. And that's also kind of where I wanted to take this, because I think I wanted to close by saying that, like, when people of color start organizing to make this space a space that nurtures audiences of color, guess what? That's a broader audience for documentaries that benefits all filmmakers. When filmmakers organize for better distribution deals that make impact campaigns possible, so protagonists and impacted communities can accrue some of the benefits of sharing their stories, that's not only the right thing to do, but it creates a foundation for other filmmakers' campaigns and other issues as well to get uplifted. When people of color start organizing to tell the story as they wish to tell it on their own terms, that creates a foundation of independence that all filmmakers benefit from. And so I just want to leave this conversation with that front and center, that this is a conversation about kind of paving this future for this space for filmmaking and for the country at large that is more exciting, more robust, more powerful. And it's because of the work that you all are doing. And it's also because of the work that the people that came before you that made it possible for you all to be you, and the institutions that nurtured all of us. I think that's really, really important. And if there's nothing that you take away from this conversation today, I think that that's it, you know? So I want to thank everyone for the work that you do and for joining me in this conversation today. I'm super proud to be in community with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sahar. Thank you, everyone.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Sahar. Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Espero
Bye.
algún día
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Beyond Resilience, hosted by DOC NYC. Thank you to Sahar, our moderator, and our panelists, Chloe, Kique, Madeleine, and Miriam, as well as to our ASL interpreters, Amber and Brenda, and language interpreters, Ellie and Liz. Scan the QR code to stay connected via our newsletter and to watch previous episodes of Beyond Resilience on our website, www.firelightmedia.tv/beyond-resilience. Thank you again from our team here at Firelight Media.